Hello, IB people. We are back with part two of my presentation series working through my IB history slide presentations about the People's Republic of China. So the video. I started the video series with the slide presentation where we are looking at the consolidation of the communist state under Mao, with a focus right now on foreign policy. In my first video, I got through the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and I began talking about the Korean War from China's perspective. In today's video, I'm going to conclude talking about the Korean War, and I'm also going to talk about a few other foreign policy items, including something that I forgot to mention last video, which is this right here. In 1951, the P.R.C. concludes a diplomatic agreement with Tibet. So this item was not in the slideshow in the previous video, but it is very important. So again, today we're going to wrap up talking about the Korean War. We're going to talk about the 17-point agreement with Tibet, and then I'm going to touch on a couple other aspects of foreign policy, at which point you will have a good amount of information regarding consolidation, and then a good amount of information regarding early foreign policy of the P.R.C. So let's jump up to the slide where I left off last video, and it was this slide here. Um, this is a painting that is in a martyrs cemetery complex in Shanghai, and it shows us the Korean War from a Chinese perspective. The Chinese are here in the trenches, fighting back an onslaught from American and UN forces. We have some GIs over here. We have a jet fighter strafing them. We've got some tanks. And the Chinese, in their heavily padded winter uniforms, are looking very valiant as they fight off this attack. So let's continue right from there. So we call it in the United States, we call it the Korean War. We also call it the Forgotten War because it's a war that gets overshadowed by what happened before it, World War II, and what comes after it, Vietnam. It may also be a forgotten war to some degree because it resulted in a stalemate. I don't know, that may have some bearing on why Americans don't look at it more closely. But from the Chinese perspective, that's a relevant point. You know, in the US, we call it the Forgotten War. It was fought to a stalemate. From the Chinese perspective, the PRC, this was a really glorious conflict. That's the way it is framed today by the Chinese state. The full name of the conflict is the War to Resist U.S. Aggression and Aid Korea. That's a mouthful, but it shows us how they were framing and how they continue to frame this conflict. So the role of the PRC, a Chinese general, Peng Dehuai, will lead the Chinese forces in an all-out assault on the U.S. and UN troops. Remember that the United States went to the United Nations and asked the Security Council to intervene on behalf of South Korea. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council because the Security Council was not recognizing the PRC as China. They continued to recognize the Republic of China, Taiwan. And that gave the US a window of opportunity to get the United Nations behind South Korea. Chinese troops are very poorly equipped. They are an underdeveloped country. They just came out of a civil war. They just came out of World War II. This is a book cover from a series of books by Osprey Publishing, and they give detailed guides to the uniforms and equipment of soldiers in different conflicts. So this is showing you what over here a North Korean officer, as well as what I think are Chinese foot soldiers here with their heavily padded winter coats because the climate was extremely frigid during this war. Chinese troops were poorly equipped, but they had a lot of experience and they had a lot of grit. They had just They were wrapping up a civil war that they had just concluded with the nationalists, and they had just expelled the Japanese from their country. Um, on the other hand, the United States grossly underestimated China's willingness to fight, China's determination, um, and the US also had other challenges because they were trying to coordinate an international force. And it was early in the Cold War, and they were just gaining their footing in terms of getting involved in Cold War conflicts overseas. In the end, the two sides fight to a stalemate, unfortunately, ending up almost where they were in the very beginning. So, in the previous video, you had seen these two maps. The war began with an all out assault by the North Koreans on the south, pushing the South Korean and American forces down to Busan. Then General Douglas MacArthur carried out this very daring amphibious landing at Incheon and pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the border with China, the Yellow River. At which point, third picture, about 1 million Chinese volunteers crossed over into North Korea. They weren't volunteers, but they were labeled as such, as a means of trying to prevent escalation, because if China were more formally involved, it could have broadened the scope of this war. So China referred to the soldiers they sent as volunteers. They pushed the American and UN forces back to around the 38th parallel. And the war ended not with a peace treaty, not with a formal conclusion of warfare, but with an armistice. Just a ceasefire, basically. And this is where we are to this day. There has not been a formal end to the conflict, and the peninsula is divided by a demilitarized zone. And you may have seen on social media or in the news when North and South Korea meet, or honestly, when Korea comes up in the news, you will often see footage of the area between the two countries. There's one part of the demilitarized zone where the two sides are able to meet one another inside of these low blue buildings to carry out diplomacy. I had mentioned Peng Dehuai, and he's an important character. He's going to come up later, so I wanted to say a few things about him. He was incredibly badass. He started out as a dirt poor peasant from the same province as Mao Zedong, Hunan province. He survived the Long March. He fought the Japanese in World War II, the Second Sino-Japanese War, it's also known as. And he fought the Kuomintang, aka KMT. So he, being an accomplished general, he led the Chinese forces in the Korean War, and he operated out of an abandoned mine shaft. I'm painting this picture of Peng Dehuai right now because he will come up later in the story of the P.R.C. So I just wanted to establish him right now. He is a very accomplished general. He is a textbook example of a successful communist, someone who started from nothing and then became very accomplished, but he maintained outwardly, he maintained a pretty humble appearance. So remember the name Peng Dehuai because he will come up later. What was the home front like during the Korean War? And when I say the home front, we're obviously here talking about the Chinese home front. So domestically in the PRC, how was the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, spinning this? Well, they ran a propaganda campaign called Resist America, Aid Korea. The purpose of the campaign was to rally Chinese support for waging what they saw as a defensive war. China and the U.S. and Douglas MacArthur were pushing toward the Yalu River. Looked like they could possibly continue into China to try to, make China the Republic of China again. So The CCP framed this as a defensive war against an imperialist capitalist power. Here we have a propaganda poster of Douglas MacArthur, US General Douglas MacArthur, looking very evil with a dagger, and he's stabbing North Korean or Chinese babies. And here we have the Yalu River. And then we have a US warplane dropping bombs on China proper, so not North Korea. And if I remember correctly, there were a few instances where US bombers did drop bombs on mainland China across the Yellow River. To be honest, I don't know if it was an accident or if it was intentional. But those instances of US planes bombing Chinese sovereign territory, I mean, regardless of if it was an accident or not, that's a provocation. That could be a declaration of war. So that played very well domestically for the Chinese. Something else that this war did, and this holds true for any country, I mean, the United States as well, during times of war, governments will take take the opportunity to use warfare as a chance to increase political control over people, to try to quash dissent, to try to silence opposition. Again, it has happened throughout U.S. history, and it certainly happened in the P.R.C. So, foreign business assets were frozen December of 1950. The police were detaining and searching people that were alleged to be spies. Foreigners were popular targets. So, this Resist America Aid Korea campaign contributed to the consolidation of power by the communists in mainland China. By late 1950, this comes from Jonathan Spence, The Search for Modern China, our textbook. By late 1950, almost all foreigners had fled China, and their property/businesses were in the hands of the CCP. Let's take a look at my other poster here. And by the way, all or most of the posters I'm using come from a website called ChinesePosters.net. And I will drop that link in the description of this video on YouTube. It is a phenomenal website. I can't say enough good things about ChinesePosters.net. It is a treasure trove of high resolution primary source posters from the various periods of Chinese history. They have some stuff from before Mao, but they have a lot of posters from the period of time that we're studying in this course. And on ChinesePosters.net, you can get a translation of what the poster says, along with a description. Some of the descriptions are brief, but others are quite detailed. There's some detailed essays on the website about some of the programs. So, fabulous website. I highly encourage you to check it out. I described this one already. This one down here, it's a bit smaller, so I'll describe. We have a North Korean and a Chinese soldier with their rifles raised, maybe semi-automatic rifles raised, and they're pointing a finger at a little Douglas MacArthur who's running away from a battlefield where they've just been defeated. So the impact of the Korean War for the People's Republic of China. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second. The war ends in a stalemate. The place where they end off is hardly different from where they began. China lost 700,000 to 900,000 troops. Some estimates are higher. I tend to give the lowball estimates when I use them in class. The photograph here is a modern photograph, a relatively recent photograph of Chinese remains, the remains of Chinese soldiers being repatriated to the P.R.C. So there was so much death and devastation during the Korean War. In North and South Korea, they are still finding the remains of soldiers and identifying them, probably using genetic testing or something like that. So, although this war feels like ancient history to us, it's still a conflict that is very much alive. And again, the war ended in an armistice and not a peace treaty. So, playing devil's advocate, the war ends in a stalemate. China suffers tremendous losses. However, the PRC to this day frames this as a huge win for China, and it is celebrated as such today. So I'd like you to think why that is. Give you a moment to think about it, and then I will show you some possible answers in 3, 2, 1. So again, this is not a comprehensive list of everything that you might have said, but here are some things that explain why China saw this as a huge victory. The PRC, a country that was 1 year old, held their own against an insanely overpowered capitalist country, world's top economy, nuclear superpower, victor of World War II. And the young and scrappy and underdeveloped PRC stood their ground, was even able to push them back, as a matter of fact, from the Yalu River back down to the 38th parallel. So that gives the PRC and global on a global scale, just the communist movement, massive aura, because it's like, look what they were able to achieve. The PRC successfully defended their sovereignty, their borders. They aided a communist neighbor, and if we come back to the maps, they now have this buffer state between them and US-backed South Korea. Granted, that buffer state was there at the start before North Korea invaded South Korea, but I should say they've preserved the buffer state, which is beneficial to them. So that is how the Korean War, those are some of the ways in which the Korean War is remembered as a win for the early PRC. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about Tibet. Now, I have to give a little bit of background on Tibet before we talk about this 17-point agreement. So Tibet is this vast region in southwestern China. And I've mentioned it before in class, but just as a quick refresher, Tibet is a region that they are a distinct ethnic group, Tibetans. They have their own Tibetan language, which is written with its own script. The Tibetans many Tibetans practice Buddhism, but it's its own branch of Buddhism. Just like within Christianity, you have Catholicism, you have Roman Catholics, you have Greek Orthodox, you have Russian Orthodox, you have various branches of Protestantism, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and so on. So Tibetan Buddhism is its own branch. They have a spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, and it's not an exact comparison, but I say the Dalai Lama is like the Pope of Tibetan Buddhism, a spiritual leader. Furthermore, it's like the Pope in the sense that Dalai Lama is a title, like saying Pope. So the current Dalai Lama is this guy here, Tenzin Gyatso, and he's currently living in exile in India, and that is relevant to our story because he went into exile as a result of a war with the PRC. We will get there in a later presentation. At times in China's vast history, Tibet was an independent kingdom, and at times it was quite powerful. Tibetan rulers would intermarry with Chinese rulers. There was periods of time where they had very good trade with one another. There's a ancient trade network, not as famous as the Silk Road, but it's called the Tea Horse Road. China traded tea in exchange for Tibetan horses. And down here is a picture of a palace in Lhasa, Tibet. It's called the Potala Palace, and I'm showing you a picture of it to show you the grandeur of it. It's enormous, this massive, majestic building. So I'm using the picture to illustrate that Tibet was at times in history, very powerful civilization. Under the Qing dynasty, though, it came under control of the Qing. For that reason, the P.R.C. wanted to exert their control over Tibet. So in May of 1951, Tibetan officials and the P.R.C. concluded a 17-point agreement. On paper, it said that China was going to have sovereignty over Tibet. The Tibetan people would return, quote unquote, return to the motherland. But in exchange, the P.R.C. would not interfere with Tibetan religion and politics, because religion and politics was intertwined in Tibet, and that was a concern of the Tibetans, because communism as an ideology is atheist. They don't acknowledge religion. But the P.R.C. said they were going to respect religious, political, cultural practices. In reality, though, the 17-point agreement was going to lead to Tibet being Sinicized. And this term here, Sinicization or Sinicization, refers to the, for lack of a better term, the Chineseifying of something, to make something Chinese. And when we say Chinese, I'm saying to make something more like the Han majority culture of China. So the P.R.C. Stationed an enormous military garrison in Tibet. The Tibetans were made to grow crops dictated by the CCP as they begin embarking on their economic reforms. Han Chinese were moved into Tibet in significant numbers to try to dilute the Tibetan population and give Han Chinese a greater claim. This is a practice that is continued to this day. And the Tibetan religion was suppressed and later attacked. This will all lead to Tibetans rebelling against the P.R.C., being defeated, and then the hardcore Tibetans fleeing China and living in exile. That's a story for a later time. So to sum up, the foreign policy points that we've discussed in this presentation: October 1st, 1949, the P.R.C. is established, and the P.R.C. experiences a number of early diplomatic wins, if you will, victories, if you will. They signed that Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. In 1950, I didn't mention this before, they also gained diplomatic recognition from a number of notable countries, including the United Kingdom, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. There's a whole host of other ones that I haven't listed there. 1950, they get involved in the Korean War, which, as you saw in this presentation, they see as a victory. And then they conclude that 17-point agreement with Tibet. So their early foreign affairs had a lot of wins. There were a lot of wins for the P.R.C. One notable way in which they were frustrated in their early foreign policy is that the P.R.C. will not gain United Nations recognition until 1971. So what does that mean? What do I mean by that? If you look at this diagram here, this diagram is a modern day picture of the makeup of the United Nations Security Council. I screenshotted this and then I tweaked it. I modified it by changing some of the flags. So in the United Nations, there's a Security Council, which is responsible for trying to maintain peace and security around the world. It has 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, Great Britain, France, and China. So back in 1949, the US, Great Britain, and France, those were the countries that we know of today. But Russia was represented by the Soviet Union. That's their flag. And as of 1949, China was represented by the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek's China. So by 1950, when the nationalists had fled to Taiwan, Taiwan represented China on the world's stage. And as I mentioned in this slideshow at the start of the Korean War, the Soviet Union wasn't down with that. And they were boycotting the UN Security Council because they saw it as a joke, a farce. The USSR was like, we're not acknowledging the elephant in the room. We're letting this random little rebel faction that fled to Taiwan represent the entirety of China when mainland China clearly has an established functioning government. So the Soviet Union was boycotting those meetings. It gave the US an opportunity to get the UN behind backing South Korea in the Korean War. So all this is to say, for the 1950s and 60s, the P.R.C. is not represented on the UN Security Council. They're not represented in the United Nations. So that was not a win. Whereas you could argue these other things were wins for the young P.R.C. This was maybe not a fail, but a setback. It was it's not what they had wanted. And with that said, that concludes this presentation about foreign policy. So I'm just going to backtrack all the way to the beginning to remind you what we went over in these two videos that I've done with you so far is we're looking at the consolidation of the communist state under Mao. We special emphasis on foreign policy, foreign affairs. We looked at the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. We looked at the Korean War, the 17-point agreement with Tibet, as well as a couple other points regarding diplomatic recognition. And we concluded by talking about how they will not be recognized by the United Nations until the 1970s. Stay tuned for next time.